Jumping on today. I know everybody's busy and got a lot of things going on, and current situation that we're in just makes it that much more difficult with with COVID and the rise in cases and all that. So I know everybody's time is valuable. I just can't thank you enough for participating. Jim, Ken, Bernie, I think you guys put together a great presentation today. I think everyone's going to enjoy it. And those of you that I don't talk to in between now and then, I hope you have happy holidays. Stay safe. Do everything you can to protect yourself. Look out for yourself, and we'll go marching into the new year together. And that's all I got, Ken. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Anton, very much. And then I would like to take a brief second. They're actually on the slides too, but I think everybody here knows me and Bernie pretty well and well enough. But our bios are on there. But I want an opportunity to actually talk a little bit about Jim Frederick. That's agreed to come on here and talk about OSHA inspections and give a little bit of his background of what he did out there. But Jim Frederick draws 3 decades of experience providing occupational health and safety leadership to North America labor unions as an advocate and a resource to workers, their employers, and regulatory agencies. In his prior position, Mr. Frederick provided technical and policy guidance to the United Steelworkers, USW, and other unions as matters pertaining to occupational safety, health and safety, and the environment, including performing and overseeing more than 200 investigations of catastrophic incidences at USW facilities. Mr. Frederick continually reached beyond the USW membership and worked closely with the USW's management counterparts and organizations around the world on a wide range of projects to improve workplace health and safety. He earned a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Health, Industrial Hygiene from Purdue University, and a Master of Science in Environmental Health and Safety Management from Rochester Institute of Technology. He's a member of the NIOSH Board of Science Counselors, the ANSI Z10 Standard Committee, including the Edit Committee for the most recent version of the standard, the U.S. committee that contributes to the ISO 45001 standard, that's a management standard, the NIOSH NORA Traumatic Injury Prevention Council, the NIOSH Worker Training Program National Clearinghouse Advisory Committee, and the OSHA Metalworking Fluid Standard Advisory Committee. So Jim brings a lot of background within the health and safety of the workers. And one of our responsibilities is to train others in how we can protect our workers that are working for us in the field. So Jim, you can take it from here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Ken, thank you. And most importantly, thanks to everyone on the call for everything that you're doing during this challenging time to ensure that not only the members of the UPAT are able to receive the training and education they need to be doing their jobs, but also doing it in a manner that's within the context of this pandemic that we are all facing and keeping your folks safe as you go forward. So, thanks for all that you're doing on that front. As Ken said, my name's Jim, and, if you took nothing else away from that way too long bio that I gave you guys, I've been around the block a couple times doing work with unions on health and safety. In fact, my first job with a labor union was with the sheet metal workers at the Sheet Metal Workers Training Fund. So I certainly, relate and understand quite a bit of the structure of a union in the training fund operation. So what I was going to talk about for the next little bit of time is kind of titled, "What is OSHA doing here?" And I wanted to do this in the context of kind of my experience of how an OSHA inspection works. We'll try to draw in a few parallels to Canadian provincial health and safety enforcement. And as difficult as this is, we're going to try to make this somewhat of a discussion session and have some dialogue if possible. Please use the chat box in the Zoom at any time if you've got a question or something, and we'll either pause and catch it right away, or if it's something I'm going to cover in a a few slides or something, I'll let you know. And we also have a few poll questions just to make this interactive a little bit. And so speaking of that, the first poll question is just to get a little bit of sense of the group on the phone. Has a member of, and so Nicole, thank you. The first poll, has a member of your local union been seriously injured or killed at work or suffered a debilitating occupational disease? And the poll's open, so please, yeah, take a minute and throw in your responses to that. So a couple of people still responding. And so, yeah, that looks like folks have participated in the poll. And as kind of expected, the answer is yes. 83% of the folks said yes to that we've experienced these things in our workplaces, and to the members that we're representing. And, you know, that's pretty common as in doing training with workers and unions, depending on what industry and what sector or sectors you're talking to, is people that go to work for a living experience this as part of what they do. And so it's important to kind of frame this conversation in that context. Let me move the poll. Sorry, I'll need multiple screen stuff. The second poll question, Nicole, if we can pop the second poll question up too. Have you been involved with, you personally, been involved with an OSHA inspection, or for the Canadian sisters and brothers on the call, a Ministry of Labor inspection at a workplace? Okay, great. That looks like we've got about the participants. So that's an interesting response. So, you know, we had almost everybody had experienced, you know, some serious injury, a fatality, or a occupational illness case of a member, a coworker at work, or within the local union or unions that we have responsibilities for. But not quite as many folks on this call have had firsthand experience with the process when and if OSHA were to show up afterwards. So, you know, important to understand that not everybody has that experience firsthand with OSHA as that happens. So great. And that will just help us kind of frame some of the conversation as we move ahead here. So kind of, you know, starting with some real basic stuff, you know, who or what is OSHA? And I always think this is a nice summary of what OSHA is all about. And throughout the presentation, and I think Ken and Bernie and Nicole, the presentation's somewhere that folks can access it afterwards. There are a number of slides that have a couple of web links, or one or two web links on them for, you know, kind of some additional information just as we're going through it. So this is a good way to frame, you know, who is OSHA and what they do. This is a summary about, you know, the OSHA Act itself, and it's a law that requires employers to provide their employees with working conditions that are free from known dangers. So, you know, that kind of says it all in that first main sentence of what the OSHA Act is all about. And we're going to dig into this a little bit deeper. So I always think of it in terms of OSHA is really a number of things, but two specifically we're going to talk about today. One is it's a law. It's a law that was signed in 1970 by President Richard Nixon and put into place 50 years ago this past month, and then took some time for things to go into effect. But then a second thing is it's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So it's that entity within the Department of Labor that makes rules, enforces rules, and does a number of other things that we're going to talk about. So I always think of who is OSHA in kind of that two pieces. It's a law, and it's also a group that does some things. Parallel in Canada. So in Canada, there are provincial health and safety laws. And then there are also provincial ministries of labor that are the group that adjudicate those laws and make sure that employers and workplaces are following those laws. In Canada, there's also a federal health and safety statute, or more than one law in Canada. There's statutes, and those are for things that range from anything like highway transportation, work in airports, and other kind of provincial work that takes place in Canada. So just, there are some parallels between this. And again, for the Canadian folks that are on the call today, much of the content is based on the experiences I had over the years working with the steelworkers, which were primarily focused on the US and OSHA, but we're trying to include some content from Canada as well. So the next poll question, Nicole, if we could throw up the third one, that'd be great. What does OSHA do? And on this one, you can select one or more of the following. And the choices are: provide compliance assistance, set standards and regulation, evaluates the overall health and safety program and identifies any issues, problems, or concerns, enforces those standards and regulations, and performs thorough accident investigations following a serious injury or fatality. So go ahead and take a minute, and again, you can answer hopefully you can answer more than one of these. So, answer as many of those as you wish to.
I could only answer one.
Oh, okay.
Same here.
Okay, well, tell you what, pick the one you like the best then, and we'll run with it. No worries. Let's see, 12, 15, 18. All right, that looks like we're pretty close to the same number. If you could still dribble it in there, we'll give it one more 5 seconds or so. All right, that looks like we're pretty close to the same number. So if we take a look, kind of the most popular answer on that was the set standards and regulations to establish a baseline of safety requirements. Spot on. That is one of the key aspects of the Occupational Safety and Health Act and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, is to set those rules that are applied to our employers in workplaces that are covered by OSHA. The next one looks like it might have been the top one: provide compliance assistance to employers and unions. Again, spot on, and for sure, that is one of the things that OSHA does is not just regulate, but also help on an assistance perspective. The next answer, I guess I missed the two that were 15%. To evaluate the overall health and safety program and identify any issues, problems, or concerns. To that answer, it's kind of, that's something that if an OSHA inspection takes place, it will help give the employer and the union some sense of what's going on with their overall health and safety program. But OSHA does not have a function where they come out and look at your entire set of work and say, give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down or certify that something's good. That's not in their perspective. And then the fourth one down: enforce those standards and regulations. Spot on. That is certainly something OSHA spends a lot of time and effort. And in the federal system, there are almost 800 OSHA compliance officers. We'll talk a little bit about the nuance between federal and state OSHA here in a few minutes. And the last one on that list then was to perform the thorough accident investigations following a serious injury or fatality. And I think that's one of the most important things to spend just a minute on talking about this poll answers. When OSHA comes in following a bad accident, and again, we're going to dig into this a little bit further in the next few slides, but when OSHA comes in following a bad accident, they are truly not performing an accident investigation. What they're doing is they're taking their set of rules and seeing if the workplace was in compliance with the applicable rules at the time that incident took place, within the context and the structure that it was in at the time. But often when OSHA comes in after a serious injury or fatality, we think in terms of it being an accident investigation. And an accident investigation really has some real differences to it. With an accident investigation, we're trying to get to some causal factors of what took place that resulted in this incident happening. But with OSHA, it may or may not be the result of the investigation. So that's an important distinction to talk through and kind of keep in mind as we're talking about this. And, as you roll some of this out within your structure within your district or your local unions, to understand that concept of what OSHA does and doesn't do. So let me hit to the next slide. So again, kind of the three I wanted to spend a few minutes on are the OSHA sets the rules. They make the OSHA standards, the compliance assistance, and that provide assistance realm of things, and enforce those rules. They actually, the OSHA compliance officers that come out to work sites and you know, talk to folks, go around and look at operations to understand what's going on and identify things that are deficient from the set of OSHA rules and standards that are in place, and then write citations after the fact. And we're going to walk through that process here as we go through. Important to also kind of baseline cover that there are worker rights under the OSHA Act, and that, you know, one of the vastly important ones is that workers are entitled to working conditions that do not pose a risk of serious harm. The challenge of that is there's a lot of workplaces with hazards that pose serious physical harm, and there's a lot of people that are injured and made ill and unfortunately killed at work on any given day. So, but that is a fundamental right of the OSHA Act. OSHA gives workers and unions the right to ask OSHA to come in and inspect their workplace. It gives unions the right to use their rights under the law without retaliation and or discrimination as a result of doing something that the act provides. It gives workers and unions the right to receive information and training about hazards, methods to prevent harm, and the OSHA standards that apply to their workplace. And importantly, that the training must be in a language that the workers understand. If you've got folks that are working on a site that speak a language other than English, and that's their predominant language, then the training needs to be in the language or languages that they comprehend and understand. OSHA Act provides us with the ability and the right to get copies of test results done to find hazards in the workplace. So things like industrial hygiene monitoring of exposure to solvents or any number of things that we're looking at would be an example of that. And it gives us the right to review records of work-related injuries and illnesses. And those typically mean the log of injury and illnesses that employers are required to keep and then post annually after the end of the year in a place that's available for us to see and take note of if we need to. There are also, into the weeds on that a little bit, there are also some first reports of injury that are kind of like a quick investigation summary that goes into recording the overall injury and illnesses. And I think the second to last item on the workers' right page is that the OSHA Act allows us to have copy of medical records. If the employer has records that pertain to us as individuals, we have the rights to them, and we as individuals in a union can provide authority to the union to obtain those records if we think that's appropriate to do. So it's kind of our counterparts, the Canadian worker health and safety rights are somewhat similar, but there's some significant differences from one province or territory to the next. So, you know, it's important to understand in Canada that there are provincial differences that need to be taken into account. For most of the provinces in Canada, there's much more substantive right to refuse unsafe work, and it's something that's usually and typically in the legislation, whereas in the States, that's a much more gray and fuzzy area to make certain that it is in place for us through OSHA. And many very good resources in each province and territory. And I provided the logo and a web link to just one of them. That's the Canadian Center for Occupational Health and Safety. That again, that one's kind of a national based organization, but there are many inside each province or territory in Canada as well. So why does OSHA come to a work site? Why would they show up and even wonder what we're doing at our work sites? And there are a number of reasons or ways that OSHA would show up. There could be an OSHA complaint. There could be a referral from some other entity that says, hey, there's a problem down the street at this construction site. There could be a fatality that results in OSHA coming out. There could be something that's referred to as imminent danger, or something that could happen immediately that could cause injury or serious injury or harm to workers. It could be a follow-up from a prior inspection that they're coming out to see how a contractor has advanced on some of the things that were identified as being deficient. There could be as a result of a catastrophic incident. So catastrophic incidents are kind of framed as things that aren't fatalities, but are still putting people into a hospital. And then lastly on that list are planned inspections, that OSHA has some ability to come out and on a planned schedule make rounds of workplaces and perform inspections. And all of those can result in OSHA coming to your workplace. What we're going to focus on in the next 45 minutes or so are complaints and fatalities, because we just don't have the time to cover all of these today. So we're going to focus on complaints and fatalities. And I think I'm going to start backwards and start with fatalities. And what I would like to do is just give you a couple of examples of some two relatively recent fatalities that I was involved with in the inspection, because both of them resulted in, some OSHA involvement, and try to use that to frame the conversation a little bit. This first one took place at a facility that manufactured paper products, and this was a piece of equipment called a sheeter, and a sheeter does kind of what it sounds. It takes big rolls of paper and it makes them into the sizes of pieces of paper that come out of our printers and things. And so what this orange mechanism is, it's a process that cuts that as the roll is moving through it. It cuts it to make straight lines of paper, and it moves back and forth with the roll in order to do that. This was it looks pretty clean. This was a pretty darn new piece of equipment in the workplace, and it was in an area of the workplace where there were several of these, about a dozen of these relatively very similar pieces of equipment. That orange piece of equipment that's inside of there is called the splice cartridge, and the splice cartridge moves kind of forward in that picture. And what was taking place is that the worker that was involved with the fatal incident was doing some adjustments on the piece of equipment, and a second worker was at the controls, and he indicated to bring the splice carriage forward. And as the splice carriage moved forward, it pinned him up against that bar, and he was saying, turn it back. And what happened was, these were the controls to that piece of equipment. And this isn't a bad picture, though actually, those little kind of, like a silver square above each of those 4 buttons really don't say anything. I think the one, there's a P on the one on the left, and the other 3 really don't say anything. As you can see, barely see, someone had utilized something like a Sharpie marker to mark what those buttons do. And the important thing is that on this piece of equipment, when you wanted to move that splice carriage forward, you turned it to the right. When you wanted to reverse it, you turned it further to the right. On every other of the dozen pieces of equipment that were the same in that room, when you wanted to move that splice carriage forward, you turned it to the right. And when you wanted to have it go backwards, you turned it to the left or reversed it. And so the worker that was at the controls, when he said, move it back, he tried to turn it to the left like it was set up for every other piece of equipment, and it didn't do anything. In fact, he tried to turn it so hard that he pulled the button right off, the knob right off of that control panel. And so what this is, it's a number of things, but it's important to understand that when things like controls in our workplace aren't standardized, that they in and of themselves pose a hazard to ourselves and our coworkers. And we've got to be cognizant of that, and learning to take from these investigations. And one of the important things is when these really tragic and awful things happen, is that we do try to learn from them and pass those learnings along to other workplaces so that we don't make those mistakes again in the future. I wanted to share a second example of a second fatality, and this was a fatality that took place at a steel facility in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it was in October of 2017. And it involved an experienced worker. He had more than 20 years at the facility. He was a second generation worker at that facility. His name was Kelvis Price, and Kelvis was working on a 7,000-pound steel plate that was like in this picture. This picture is not actually from that workplace, but one I found that looked an awful lot like it. It was a big piece of plate metal that was being suspended from a crane with a magnetic crane. So the magnet was holding the steel up, and he was burning the bead from a cut. So as they made a cut to size, what this facility did, they took big plate metal, and if you needed a piece of plate metal that was 1 foot by 3 foot, they would cut it to that size and send it out to your workplace for you to utilize. So when they made those cuts, it left a little bead on the piece of metal that was left, and they would burn that off so that they would have a clean edge of the metal. So that plate fell, pinned him, and 7 hours later, he succumbed to those injuries and he passed away. Um, when I got there to help with the local union with the investigation, I got there the next morning very early, and OSHA had just arrived as well. The OSHA had started their process, and they were in a conference room with the employer when the local union president and I came in, and the employer seemed very sincere and certain that work was never performed like this and that this violated procedure. What specifically they said, we never perform work on a suspended load. When something's up in the air on a crane, we don't do work on it. The local union president shook his head. At a break, we went around the facility, and during the course of the next couple of days, we talked to every person who worked in that facility, and every one of them to a person indicated that Kelvis had done that work not only like they all did, but like they were trained to do when they got there. And so what this is an example of is how work as performed differs from work as imagined. And so the illustration of this is in this diagram that's often referred to as the black line and blue line. And the black line, if you can think of it, is the way that the employers, for all good intentioned reasons, think of work. Work is performed. We're going to start at point A. We're going to go to point B. It's a very linear, straightforward process. We might have a standard operating procedure or a set of rules or something that tells us how to get there. And when we start at the left side of the screen, we follow that line. We get to the right side. At the right side, we produce our product or our service or whatever it is we're doing. But one of the things we know is that when workers perform work, it doesn't really look like that is imagined, of that straight line and that standard operating procedure. That workers adapt in order to perform their work to get the job done. They want to get to that same end of successfully completing the work, but it's not always in that way that's imagined by the employer. And that successful work happens 99.99999% of the time. We do that over and over again, and we're successful. But one of the things that's also important is in these workplaces, there's a hazard, or there's sometimes many hazards, and that those hazards are kind of hanging around down there. And the danger is, as the hazard gets closer to how we're performing the work, what's keeping us from coming into contact with that hazard? And those are kind of the life-saving health and safety controls that are a whole other topic of conversation. The thing we learned from this incident in Milwaukee was that not only was there one way that workers adapted to do the work, there were a number of ways that workers adapted to do the work. And on that day of the incident that killed Kelvis Price, Kelvis was performing the work and that hazard came into contact with him. And when it did, there was an incident. And again, unfortunately, in this case, it resulted in a fatality. So kind of the take home lesson from this is that in a traditional safety model, there's a much focus on the blue line. The employers focus on the blue line following an incident. After the incident, they want to look back and say, well, Jim didn't follow the standard operating procedure. And if he had, this might never would have happened. But what we know from this is that the blue line is really the way that work gets done. And it's much, much more important to shift the focus on health and safety management systems to normal work, to understand the blue line before the incident. And if the health and safety professionals of the world can focus on how work is actually being performed, we can make huge inroads on improving controls so that people don't become injured, made ill, or killed at work. So sorry, that was all. Just those two examples were a little bit of foundation just to make sure we had an understanding of what's going on around fatalities in workplaces. So the reason OSHA shows up if there's a fatality in the workplace is the employer is required to let them know that they had a fatality in the workplace. They have to notify OSHA and say, gosh, we had this fatality. And then OSHA will typically respond relatively quickly to come out and perform their process. So that's the baseline of how OSHA shows up after a fatality in a nutshell. I want to shift over and talk about complaints and OSHA complaints for a few minutes, because this is the other prevalent way that workers and unions wind up having OSHA come out to a work site and see what's going on. So with a complaint, there's a number of ways that complaints can be submitted. They can be done online. They can be done by a fax and mail system. They can be phoned in. It's as easy as picking up the telephone and calling your local area OSHA office and saying, we have a health and safety problem and we need some help from OSHA. But there's some nuance and difference as to how OSHA responds depending on how we submit the complaint that's important to understand. There are kind of two categories. One is called a formal complaint, and the other is an informal complaint. The delineation between the two is that for a formal complaint, OSHA physically comes out to a workplace and performs an in-person inspection of that workplace. An informal complaint typically results in OSHA doing it remotely. It used to be called the phone and fax system, and I think now they may use a slightly different term for that. But it means they don't come out in person. They contact the employer and say, we understand there's a concern about ladders at this construction site, and we'd like you to show us that you have appropriate ladders for the job that's being done, or whatever the content of the complaint was. So I had always said while I was with the steelworkers was it's important to have that formal complaint submitted because it resulted in OSHA actually coming out to the workplace. And the way to make a formal complaint happen is for it to be a written complaint with a signature in place, and to state that this is in the context of what is written down, that says this is a formal complaint and we would like to have an OSHA inspector come to our site and investigate the hazards. Now, one more important piece of the informal complaint process is an informal complaint can be flipped over to become a formal complaint under a couple of circumstances. One would be the employer is just not responsive to OSHA when they send them the information with the questions. But two is if the union or a worker or a set of workers finds out that there is an informal complaint and they call OSHA and say, hey, OSHA, the employer is not doing what they said they are doing with you, or, there are 27 bad ladders and they took a picture of the one good ladder and sent it to you. So again, important to understand the difference. And if you want OSHA to show up at the work site, formal complaints are the way to go. So I was hoping that just in the chat box, if people could respond to this, true or false, the union should always file complaints anonymously. And I need to turn on the chat box on my view. Sorry. So yeah, if people could just answer true or false that the union should file false. Several falses. We'll give it just a minute to see if there's any. It looks like false is the answer of the day. So yeah, I agree that there are a number of reasons that it is appropriate and important to include the representative from the union on the OSHA complaint. One is that, as a representative, there are some other protections from the National Labor Relations Act that give you a little bit more help if there is a problem after the fact. But two, and importantly, is if this is an issue that has risen to the occasion that we need to file an OSHA complaint, the union darn well ought to make sure it's front and center with the employer that said, you had your 3 chances to fix this and you left us no option. So we filed this OSHA complaint on behalf of our members at this site. So great, appreciate the response on that. And get back to that window. And then the second, one more, true and false. OSHA complaints are the best strategy, and we always get what we want done when we file a complaint. So again, if you can use the chat box and just use true or false, that'd be great. And we're getting false again. False again, thank you. And so yeah, I spot on agree with you here as well. Over the course of 30 years of working with various labor unions on health and safety matters, I can count on kind of one hand the number of times I personally filed an OSHA complaint on behalf of a local union or local unions with an OSHA situation. Kind of our rule of thumb experience was we could get more done with the possibility or the promise of an OSHA complaint versus the complaint process in and of itself. That's not to say OSHA doesn't have a time and a place that is needed, necessary, and particularly after those serious injuries and fatalities when they come out for the catastrophic event or the fatality investigation. Those are really important, and we want to make sure those happen. But OSHA, kind of a rule of thumb, OSHA as a tool is not always the best strategy to get fixed what we need to get fixed. And so the local union hopefully has some other tactics in play, from anywhere from being the a safety committee to other processes where we're working with the employers to fix some of those issues. So bumping right along on this, an OSHA inspection is supposed to be conducted without advance notice. The employer is not supposed to know when OSHA is coming out. We already talked about it could be on-site, or it might be this phone and fax investigation. And it is supposed to be performed by a highly trained set of compliance officers, either one or more, but compliance officers. And then OSHA has a set of priorities in their process with everything they have in front of them of which things they go to first. And so that includes going to things that are imminent danger, those things that could happen right away and cause serious injury, fatality, responding to the catastrophic events and the fatalities. Worker complaints and referrals kind of come in third on that list. And that's part of the reason a formal complaint is important, because it's pretty high up on the OSHA priority. And then the targeted inspections and follow-up investigations. So that's kind of, from top to bottom of OSHA's priorities of which things to come out to. So then the next question in this process is, what does OSHA do when they get to my workplace? And it's a pretty straightforward process for OSHA. They start by researching the site and understanding who you are, what you do. This is a construction site with multiple contractors building a high-rise office space building, and there are, as we know it, a general contractor with 8 subs on it this week. They come to the site, they present their credentials, they ask for the person with the responsibility for OSHA compliance at the site. They are also then at that point supposed to also ask if it's a unionized workplace or facility, and then ask the employer to notify the union or unions highest ranking official on site at the time that OSHA is there for an inspection. They hold what is referred to as an opening conference, or just a meeting to kind of get things moving and talk about the scope of what they're going to look at and the areas that they plan to go out to look at. And then they perform the actual inspection. And that includes kind of 3 elements: a walk around, where they're going to go out and they're going to look at the workplace and the hazards and take some documentation that might be photos. It could feasibly be some air monitoring. They may do some review of paperwork and records, and just generally inspect the workplace. They often, almost always, but often, will do some employee interviews. Employees may be union members, but they want to talk to folks that recognize and understand the scope of the work that they're looking at. And then they'll do some research, and they'll understand what they saw and compare it with other practices in the industry, as well as what the OSHA standards require. And then following all of that, it may be the same day, but more than likely it's a later day, or even several weeks or longer later, there'll be a closing conference. And the closing conference is just kind of closing out that section of the OSHA investigation, and they're not coming back out to the site after the closing conference. Here's our initial thoughts of a couple of things that we saw that were not in compliance with OSHA standards. So I mentioned the union representation, and starting with that very start of that, where they present their credentials before the opening conference, they should ask the employer if it's a unionized facility, and the union should be notified about that. And then the union has the right to participate in the process, including the opening conference, the inspection, almost all the elements of that. When it gets to employee interviews, there are a couple of nuances of sometimes, for example, when they're interviewing management, that if OSHA has not allowed management in the room with with the union members when they're interviewing them, they're obviously not going to let the union representative in the room when they interview the management representative. And OSHA might not let any representatives in the room for some or all of those of those interviews. And then the closing conference. And the union has rights to participate in all parts of that, again, with the delineation around the interviews, to some extent around the interviews. So the one more question for y'all was that I wanted to ask was just, are there some experiences you have had with either OSHA or in Canada, the Ministry of Labor, the experiences you've had that you'd like to share? We had an inspection, it was great, and this is what they did, or some other question. Oh, and here's a question. A question was asked on the chat. It said, can OSHA be sued? And that is an interesting question. So essentially, for the U.S., what we're asking, can the government be sued? The answer to that is yes. And where it happens a lot with OSHA is around the rulemaking process. And so with OSHA, there's oftentimes litigation around rulemaking. But we'll come back to another example of kind of the process after the fact that's kind of like a little bit of legal haranguing. So any other experiences with an OSHA inspection that y'all have experienced? And if you can, just, throw anything into a chat, or thanks for that.
Jim, I have a question.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the fatality in that that plant setting where the plate dropped on the gentleman.
Yes.
I may have missed this. Did you touch on what happened with the end result of the investigation? Charges?
Sorry, I moved too quickly through that. I apologize. Yeah, let me touch on kind of what we found through the course of the steelworker model for post fatality and serious injury situation was the steelworker model had the union had a process where a local union could notify the Pittsburgh office about a fatality or serious injury, and someone from Pittsburgh would come out to assist the local union on a couple of things, but in my case specifically, it was to help with the investigation. And so in this process of this investigation, I was there to help the local union with that investigation. And what we identified there was that picture I showed. I can flip back up to it for just a second. That picture we showed of that plate metal on a magnet, on a crane with a mag lift on it. That's a pretty decent shaped crane. The one that we were talking about, and the cranes in that facility where this fatality occurred, looked like they were probably 50, 70 years old. They were in really bad physical condition, and what it appeared to have happened was that the electromagnetic the electro part of the electromagnetic piece of that equipment lost power somehow through a short. There were exposed wires, all sorts of things. So what we identified was faulty lift. The lifting device was at fault and caused that to fall. What OSHA cited from that, oh gosh, I apologize, I should be able to pull this right out of my head. OSHA cited the employer for something pertaining to cranes, but I do not recall the exact citations that were issued. But yeah, that was kind of the causal factors that we identified were A, that folks had not been properly trained, B, that the procedure that was being followed out on the shop floor looked nothing like what the employer thought it looked like, and C, that piece of equipment was faulty. And one other thing we identified in this was workers working in isolated spaces where they're in this case, no one else. This happened and he was stuck. He didn't die right away. He was stuck there for quite some time before someone found him. And so, we really thought one thing that should be improved in that workplace was to make sure that there are people close enough proximity to each other that they could keep an eye on each other, or some other way of, having a notification that something was going bad. So, and again, I apologize, I can't remember exactly what the OSHA citations were in that case. They weren't extensive. So, okay, well, here to keep on, keep on time, let me kind of keep moving forward a little bit. In Canada, there's kind of a comparable system that's called a coroner inquest, and this is quite different from the Ministry of Labor in the province coming out and doing the inspection to understand what Canadian ministry standards were not followed. But this is a public hearing conducted by a coroner in front of a community member, so jury of 5. And the inquests, the purpose of these is to try to come up with an understanding of the circumstances of a death. And again, from my years with the steelworkers, one of the things that would often be utilized by the union in this process was to make sure that the union was able to help the inquest see the work causal factors and the unsafe conditions that were in place that led to the incident causing the fatality. And then, as this says, utilizing those results from the inquest to try to prevent further deaths, both at that workplace where it took place, but in a broader context of workplaces with similar hazards and things. So again, OSHA is not coming in to perform a thorough accident investigation. What they're doing is to evaluate compliance with their standards, and their standards are just a set of rules that employers are supposed to follow in order to be part of their overall health and safety management system, and reduce the risk to workers from being injured, made ill, or killed at work. They're the stuff the employers have to follow in order to keep out of trouble with the government. There's also, there's only a few hundred pages of OSHA standards, but there are a limitless number of hazards and unsafe conditions in workplaces. So the other part of the OSHA Act that's really important to understand is duty clause, and it's section 5 of the OSHA law, section 5, paragraph A, subparagraph 1, and it's that bolded statement there, kind of toward the top of the page. It says, each employer shall furnish to each of his employees employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious injury, serious physical harm to his employees. So essentially what the general duty clause says is our employers are required to give us a safe place to work. And if they're not giving us a safe place to work, OSHA can cite the employer using this and not one of the specific specific standards or regulations in the instance where there's not a specific standard or regulation. There's some more to this, but it gives the OSHA the ability to cite something where there's no rule and something took place that went poorly. In 2019, this is a list of the top 10 OSHA standards that were cited by OSHA during the year 2019. And specifically for y'all, and since a big chunk of your work happens with your members on construction sites, the construction standard numbers are the ones that start with 1926, and the general industry standards are those that start with the 1910. And so as you look through this list, you see that construction standard violations are 6 of the 10 or something like that. So, it's just to kind of put in context, there are a lot of OSHA inspections going on at a lot of construction sites, issuing a fair number of citations. The problem is there's a way more number of construction sites going on in this country than there are OSHA inspectors to get to. Just like there are a whole lot more fixed industrial manufacturing or service sector workplaces than there are OSHA inspectors to get to. So I think the next, Nicole, the next and maybe even the last poll question is, which of the following are union representative rights during an OSHA inspection? So, and again, we probably can only answer one, but if you can pick out the one you think is the most important of this list: participate in OSHA's opening conference, participate in OSHA's walk around, always participate in employee interviews, participate in the closing conference, that the union rep must be paid by the employer during an inspection, and that the union rep will not experience retaliation by the employer. And finally, the union rep has an obligation to represent union members during an OSHA inspection. So take a second here and check one of these, and we'll talk through it in just a minute. All right. Well, it looks like the numbers are pretty steady here. So let's go ahead. We'll end that poll. We'll just talk about a couple of these for a minute. So it looked like the um, which of the following are union representative rights during an inspection? And it looks like the last one had the most answers to has an obligation to represent union members during an OSHA inspection. And I think that is spot on. You know, I certainly believe both from, you know, the duty of fair representation that unions have to represent our members, but also, you know, just the moral obligation of the union having important role in making sure our sisters and brothers have a safe place to work. The union has a role in this and should be engaged and involved after we get some training and understand the process. A couple of the other answers that were answered on here: participate in the opening conference, spot on. We talked about that. Participate in the walk around, spot on. We also talked about that. Always participate in employee interviews. Remember, there's a couple situations where it might not be in every interview. One is if they're interviewing management and they did not allow management to sit in on our interviews with our members, they're sure not going to let us sit in on those with management. And two is sometimes the OSHA inspector has the right to say, this is a really delicate situation. I'm going to talk to this witness without any representation from the union. Often employers try to bully their way, or their lawyer tries to bully their way into those interviews, and it's something to be cognizant of. When the employer's lawyer comes up to a union member and says, "I'm here to work with you on the OSHA process," what they're really saying is, "I represent your employer and their best interests, and I want to make sure I know everything you've said in there so that I can cover my client's butt afterwards." Participate in the closing conference is another that, yes, we have the right to be there and really ought to be there. Must be paid by the employer during the inspection. Nobody bid on that, and that's for sure. The employer does not have an obligation to pay the union rep during the OSHA inspection. One of the things that the steelworkers, I always recommended to local unions, they ask the employer that question in front of the OSHA inspector and make the employer say no or yes. You know, maybe you can goad them into saying yes, but make them say no in front of the OSHA inspector. And then, you know, you can kind of roll your eyes and look at the OSHA inspector and they get the message. Will not experience retaliation by the employer. Legally, the employer cannot retaliate against any worker or union representative for doing what is their rights under the OSHA Act, but it happens all the time. And that's, you know, a whole other training on retaliation and whistleblower rights under the OSHA Act. But it's just to say that does happen, and we got to be cognizant of that. And then we already talked about that last one. So great. Thank you for those answers on that poll. Let me just move that window back over. And then, so we'll book through these next few slides to get us to keep us on close to the time here. But preparing for an OSHA inspection, here are a few tips of things that from my experience are very useful for a local union to do before an inspection, before a bad accident takes place that OSHA shows up. You don't want to, this is one thing you don't want to learn on the fly. It's a lot better to have a plan in place, and then we execute our plan when we need to. But we should be keeping good records of health and safety issues. If there's safety committee meeting minutes and things like that, those should be on paper somewhere in a file or electronic records. Document and track workplace hazards. If our members raise concerns about safety and health, we should document those, share them with the employer, expect them to fix the things that are wrong, and keep track of those things that are fixed as well as those things that are not fixed. Communicate with the membership on health and safety issues. Have dialogue, engage with the members to make sure that they know the union is a resource to them and we're here if they need us and when they need us on health and safety matters. Have or safety representatives, and make sure that those folks that are the union members in those functions understand OSHA and this whole process. Research the local union contractors' OSHA inspection history. I'll hit on that in just a minute of how to do that. Have the safety committee representatives get to know the area OSHA staff. This has been an important lesson that I took away from a number of bad scenarios was if a union can just take a day once every couple of years and send paid time off for the union time for the day and send the safety committee over to the OSHA office. If you show up at about 8:30 in the morning with a box of donuts and say, hey, I'd like to meet some of the OSHA inspectors that are in the office today, you're going to have a really nice conversation over a couple of cups of coffee around the conference room table. And one of the most compelling things to get OSHA to help you out is by knowing the OSHA compliance officers, because then when an issue comes up with the workplaces you were talking about, the person who met you is going to say, hey, I know that one on their morning meeting. They'll come out to inspect your workplace. And when you walk into that opening conference, then after the employer tells you OSHA's there, and you say, hey, Bernie, it's nice to see you again. Does your son still wrestle? The employer's chin typically hits the table, and you can be sure that you've got a little bit of a leg up on the process. So know the membership and the concerns of the work site. It's just very important to engage in that communication process with our members. And it's not something easy. It's not just a light switch that you can turn on. This is something that takes a lot of priming of that pump to get it started. And then most importantly, the last bullet, have the records that we've kept and maintained readily available at the worksite or somewhere that we can get them to the worksite relatively quickly should something bad go wrong. And particularly because OSHA will ask the employer for a lot of paper and records. And if we have some of the same documentation, it's a wise thing to provide copies to OSHA as well. And, if it's the exact same thing as the employer is giving them, great. But if it's different than what the employer is giving them, also great, because that's important for OSHA to understand something was documented differently than what you're seeing from it when you ask the employer. So as I said, I would come back to this. If you want to know if your employer has ever been inspected by OSHA, if you go to the OSHA website and then just search with the little, magnifying glass looking icon for establishment search, you will get to a website that is a fairly user-friendly database that you can search employers by name and location and see if they have ever been cited by OSHA in that database. And state plan OSHAs, we're going to get to the federal versus state plan OSHAs in just a second, but state plan OSHAs should be included in that database as well. So Bernie's going to cover some of this after the inspection in a few minutes when I get done. I'll just highlight a couple of things that the citations that the OSHA decides to issue have to be issued within 6 months of the initial documentation of the occurrence of the hazard. And then the question I always say to people, are we done here? Once the citation issued, are we done? And the answer is no. In fact, sometimes we're really just off the starting line, and we've got a long way to go before the issue is resolved. And the goal of this overall has always been, in my view, is what we're trying to do is improve the overall health and safety management system and reduce the risks that our members are facing when they go to that workplace. So quickly, the kind of citations that OSHA can issue, there's all these different names of them, from de minimis, other than serious, willful, repeated, failure to abate, and egregious. And it kind of goes from the lightest to the worst, top to bottom of that list. The OSHA citation that is issued is just a document, a legal document, that kind of like getting a speeding ticket, but this citation describes the OSHA violation requirements that weren't followed, that were violated. It lists proposed penalties. We'll talk about dollar amounts in just a second, and it gives them a deadline of how soon they have to correct the problem. Let me just focus for 1 or 2 slides on willful and the egregious citations. And that's just a picture of an actual OSHA citation from somewhere that I just grabbed from a steelworker file before years ago. A willful citation essentially means the employer knew better. They knew this was not supposed to be the way it was, yet it was wrong, and somebody got hurt or a complaint was issued, and they came in and saw the violation. The employer was aware of it. In a fatality with a willful citation, there's an avenue for criminal prosecution, but it does not happen very often. Separately in Canada, there's an entire other process for legal ramifications after after a worker fatality. That in Canada is not a well-used law either, but it's important to know it can happen in both countries and does happen once every blue moon, not even that frequently in the US. The egregious violations are the things that were really bad, and instead of issuing one citation, if this was about that ladder example we talked about earlier, and there were 50 ladders, there will be 50 individual egregious violations issued on the 50 different ladders, and those won't be grouped or combined in any way throughout the process, hopefully. Penalties that OSHA issues, I think this is still the right numbers, although at the change of the year, the dollar amounts, they're tied to an inflationary factor. So at the end of the fiscal year back in October, they actually may have bumped up slightly with inflation. But for each serious citation, OSHA can issue up to $13,494, and for the willful or repeated violations, up to $134,937. So as you can see, OSHA's got a little bit more punch on the willful or repeated violation, but something that, again, from my experience with employers across the workplaces that the steelworkers represented, oftentimes the dollar amount's not really what the employer cared about. You know, they spend more money than 5 serious violations at 14 grand, $70,000. They spend more than that on you know, the Christmas party. So it's not so much about the money, but it's about the paper, the citation in and of itself. So one option is, after the citation's issued, the employer can pay the penalty, fix the hazard, and move forward, or they can appeal it or contest it. And quickly, the appeal process is kind of this multi-step. They ask for an informal conference, and if I were talking to any employer, I'd say, well, you very well ought to at least request an informal conference, because at the informal conference, OSHA will often knock a few bucks off of the fine and say, if you pay this reduced amount, we can get out of the room. The union ought to be there. The union has the right to be there, and is supposed to be notified of when and where that informal meeting is going to happen. It's often at like the area OSHA office, not at the work site, but the employer is supposed to share that information with the union. Does it happen all the time? Nope. but it's something that we have the right to be involved with. Step 2 is there can be a settlement agreement. So the parties, the Department of Labor for the federal cases, or the state for the state plan cases, and the employer with the union involved, if we're engaged in the process, can work to a settlement and resolve it. I was always a very big proponent of settlement process within an OSHA citation construct, if we could improve the health and safety, overall health and safety of that workplace, and kind of, you know, who cares about how much they pay at the end of the day? Let's just make health and safety better. OSHA's goal is to correct the hazards and compliance in the workplace. Just always keep that in mind. And then if the settlement process doesn't work, the employer has a certain amount of time they can appeal or contest the citation. OSHA then passes this over to the Department of Labor lawyers. They're called solicitors, and the solicitors work through the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission to resolve those. And then, you know, that last question mark there, can the union be involved with that? Yes. And that's, again, party status, which I know Bernie's going to cover when we get to. So we'll cover that in just a few minutes. So the last point, I think the second to last point I wanted to cover was just, there are differences between federal OSHA and state plan OSHAs. In this map, I know these are cruddy colors, but the kind of middle shade of blue are the state plan OSHA states. And so the example that the brother raised earlier from Nevada is a state plan OSHA state. So essentially a state plan OSHA, every state has the right to put in their own OSHA infrastructure. And if they do that, the feds actually pay a part of the bill of the budget for that every year to the state. The rule is that if state does that, they have to put in enough resources to make it happen, and they have to be at least as effective as the federal OSHA is. The lighter color blue, the kind of powder blue color, are the federal OSHA states, and those are the states where The federal OSHA area offices and regional offices have the authority to come out and do all the work that OSHA does in the field. Those that are in the darker shade of blue are federal OSHA states, but the reason they're a different color is that in those 6 or so states and the Virgin Island, there is also in place a state plan element that covers state, county, and municipal employees, because one of the oddities that we didn't bother getting into in this explanation is OSHA doesn't have this jurisdiction over state and municipal employees. So we've already covered this briefly, but the resolving of the contested cases is this can go to that OSHA review commission, and ultimately in some really outside of the norm cases can be appealed through a federal court. And just, one quick example of that, of one of the very first fatality cases I worked on when I was with the Rubber Workers Union back in the middle 90s was a case at Dayton Tire in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And it was citations around lockout, tagout, and ergonomics. And that went through a process. It took 2 decades to finally be resolved in the federal court system. And unfortunately, in that case was resolved after that plant had closed. So, at the end of the day, there was a lot of effect of the outcome of that case on the rest of the industry. But for those folks that worked at that facility, it really kind of, the system let them down because it did not provide the protections that it should have. So last point I wanted to make was that the IUPAT certainly has resources available to you on, kind of how you go about some of this work within your area or local unions that you're working with. And, I'd strongly encourage that communication and dialogue to be happening on an ongoing basis before the next big incident happens, so that you're ready and have a plan in place. And then I just threw in here, if needed, this is in the presentation that you have, how to contact OSHA. And there's a phone number, the 1-800-OSHA number, as well as a few links to get to some of their stuff. And we already talked about that, and just a couple of good sources of information. Those, I think if you click on those pictures, when you get a copy of the presentation, it will take you to a link to them. Oh wait, Bernie, I'm sorry, I apologize. These are your slides.
All right, Jim, you're doing such a good job.
Yeah, so I'll leave you, this is to Bernie's slide. No wonder I didn't recognize all of those bullets.
Oh, it's all right. I just got to say, thanks, Jim. That was a great presentation, and I guess we'll save some discussion for for right after myself, and then if Ken goes. But if not, Ken, once I'm done, just jump in and say if you want to keep going or not, or if we want to do the discussion. With that said, I just want to say, Jim sits on the Jedi Council of understanding risk, hazard in the work environment, the pressures, imparted from an employer, and how to get a worker through that conundrum as safely as possible. So I have to say, I worked quite a bit with Jim in the past, and although I had a decent toolbox of industrial hygiene at my disposal, Jim really helped me understand how to utilize a lot of those skills in the work environment to be functional, for workers. So thanks, Jim. That was a good presentation. All right, the next part. So what happens after that inspection? And I'm really going to focus on, worker involvement in some of the things that we can do as union members to not just help ourselves really, but it's going to help the work environment overall and that employer. And as Jim had on one of his slides, OSHA's main goal is to get to a work environment that doesn't have hazards in it that's going to affect workers. It's easier to do that if it's a collaborative effort, right? I mean, imagine showing up to a personal trainer you hired and they said, all right, Bernie, let's start with 10 jumping jacks. I said, nah, I'll do 2. If I'm not gonna work with my the trainer, am I going to get to an endpoint that both of us had envisioned for myself? In this case, it's a safer, more healthy work environment. So there is a lot there. So as Jim mentioned some of these things, I'll go through them a bit and then move on to the next part about really being hands-on with this process is what we can do to engage our members in post-inspection. And ideally, I say post-inspection, but as Jim said, if we can be involved in this process right along from the get-go, even before an OSHA inspector has to come in, from the recognition, evaluation of workplace, hazards, if we can get involved there first, we might not ever need an OSHA inspector. Fingers crossed. But as Jim said, there is that blue line, which points to reality. So we're going to talk about, what we can do to aid after that inspection is over. So there's going to be a closing conference, as Jim mentioned. There can be a second closing conference, which isn't the informal closing conference, if needed. And that can be done as well. Well, they'll go back in, in the inspector that conducted the evaluation. We'll do more of what typically is done in the closing conference, maybe to shore up some things of misunderstanding for the employer. And again, all these things that are going to happen, labor has the right to be a part of it. So Jim mentioned that the citations are going to be cited, issued within 6-month period. Typically that's what happens. Again, just because you get a violation though, so at that closing conference, typically what'll happen is that inspector will go in, they'll say, hey, this is what I found. They may say, this is what you be looking at. These are the kind of monetary issues that, could come out of this. This is kind of what you have to think about for abating it. They're also going to say, we're going to have, the area director. So typically the citations have to come from the area director or associate or assistant area director. And then they're going to also probably mention, our attorneys are going to look at this, right? Jim mentioned qualified OSHA inspectors. It's really important that they are good at what they do, because it's just like in investigating a crime scene, you have to make sure that you collect evidence in a defensible way. So that OSHA inspector has to really be there and be qualified and good at what they do to make sure that no attorney for the employer can poke holes in what they did and downgrade or reduce something that might lead to, maybe no abatement happening or something less what the citation is looking for. So that's important. That's why it's extremely valuable to have workers there. Because, I can tell you, it doesn't matter how good of an industrial hygienist or a safety professional or a health physicist you are, that's great, but you don't know every work environment expertly. I certainly don't. So I would want to have the expertise of somebody on the work floor going with me, being able to interact with me, where I can maybe ask some questions off to the side, like Jim said, or maybe it's more of an environment where we can interact openly in front of that employer. So that's a good thing. So what's going to happen is they'll talk about that in the closing conference. Violations, or they'll be reviewed by the director, and then if the director sees there's enough weight there, they will send citations. Once that happens, as Jim said, the employer has 15 days to request an informal conference. There's a couple things that can happen. They can accept, which means they'll pay the money and they have to abate. They can contest, the citation, or they can petition. So petition, I think, typically only deals with the time frame where they're required to abate the hazard. And again, this is an important thing for an employer to be able to do, because the OSHA inspector might not have any idea what the full lay of the land looks like, and maybe for a smaller business, to abate a hazard in 20 days might just not be doable. They might need 40 days or whatever the circumstance is. So they can do that as well. When that happens, labor representation always gets notification. In fact, with the citations, it's got to be sent to labor reps 1 day after it's sent out to the employer. Once you do get, a citation, it has to be posted in the area where that citation was governing, where that notice of violation occurred. So workers have the right to elect party status, and there's not a real great run-of-the-mill definition for this, but basically what it means is workers' labor representation is saying, hey, we don't like exactly what's going on here. We want to throw our ring into the hat officially to participate in this process to see the citation come to its end. And so that's what electing party status means. The employer cannot discriminate against workers for implementing their EHS rights, as Jim mentioned. And workers can also have the right to contest pieces of the citation that involve either timeliness. So maybe as a labor organization, you don't like that the citation said the employer has 70 days to do it. And you say, no, this is significant enough where enough of us, are exposed to this hazard. We'd like it done in 30 days. Or you can also, file against the PMA. So a petition to modify the abatement. And you've got 10 days to do that. And then again, I mentioned the employers have to post, the outcomes of these within the area that they occurred. And again, it's important for workers to be part of this because one example I have, I was doing some work for a small research and development science company. The workers there were pretty proactive. They had an emergency response team. I did work with them on that level, but the employer tended not to see the big picture. So at one point there was an accident that led to OSHA coming in and evaluating the HVAC system and the ventilation system. And they had a bunch of lab hoods. So OSHA went up on the roof. There were 10 stacks from lab hoods. And OSHA said, hey, these aren't tall enough. Took a picture of one, measured one, but they were all the same. So a citation came later and the employer said, no, I only have to fix one of them. And the workers are like, what are you talking about? There's, 9 other ones up there. They're all the same. And luckily, because the employer listened to what the workers were saying during that event, it probably, prevented something worse happening to that employer as far as monetary penalties are concerned. So it's good to participate, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Next slide, Jim, please. Here's a couple of great resources. So OSHA does have a guide. I think it's 3,000. That's on employer rights and employer rights and responsibilities and worker rights that they have underneath OSHA inspections. The National Cost Association has some great stuff. And here I'm going to hold up a prop. The book OSHA Inspections. This was actually written and developed, by an OSHA field inspector, and it was recommended to me, I don't know, like 20 years ago or something like that, by a director of Connecticut, Mike Fitz. So there are some good resources out there to help understand this process. And really, the best way to do it is hands-on. If something's happening, get involved. Get involved and go through the process once. There are, assisted sources that you can call. You can call me up. We can get some help for you that you might need at the local level. But get involved in the process, and then you'll really have a good understanding of what's going on. You'll start to feel more comfortable. Next slide, Jim. So now is kind of the meat of this. Can labor participate in post-OSHA inspection process, and what are the benefits, downfalls? Yes, they can. Yes, we can. Really, again, it's part of a collaborative process. It's going to give just that endpoint of having a safer work environment with less hazards, with reduced risk to the hazards that you have, is really what we're trying to get to here. And so it's important to participate in this process. It can aid in worker solidarity. So it's a way to actually bring something up and get a goal achieved, to get a hazard controlled. It's an opportunity to help an employer. And I'm going to talk about that in the next couple of slides, to reduce a penalty. And again, the ultimate goal is to get that hazard fixed, to get that thing out of there, to reduce the risk to it, to control it. That's the ultimate goal. And I've been involved with a couple OSHA inspection processes during settlement agreements, where I heard directly from either area director or associate director, our goal is not to put them out of business, Bernie. We just want to get those hazards fixed, right? So that's the goal. So by participating in the process as labor, an area director might more likely be inclined to reduce some of those penalties, especially if that reduction in cost could go to providing some equipment and hazard control. One of the negatives, and I can't think of too many negatives, but participating in the process could be an anxiety, provoking event, especially if the employer's like, yeah, let's do this, even though you can. Yeah, let's do this. They're doing it because it makes them look good, right? But then they want to, get back or, harm that worker in some other way through their job. And again, they're not allowed to do that. That's discrimination, and the OSHA Act prevents, as I shouldn't say prevents, has a law against that. But again, like Jim's blue line said, we know how these things tend to work. Luckily, we've got a union here, and that does make it a little bit easier to participate in these things free from reprise. And another thing that I can say that Jim has given to me is he's put me in some really unique work situations where real life is stranger than fiction. And thank God that those folks had a union behind them, because I couldn't imagine what would have happened without one, because they were just some particularly nasty, hazard-filled work environments that were part of the job, and those hazards should have been controlled, and that's what we were working towards. Next slide, Jim. So this is an example of a settlement agreement that I developed for a non-union employer. I was asked to get involved by a colleague of mine. And it's an event that really has stuck with me. It's one of the reasons why I'm so adamant about, every work site should be a union work site. So this was a electroplating facility that was recently purchased within a year. Unfortunately, the new owner didn't do their due diligence, and it came with some prior OSHA violations, citations that were never cleaned up. What happened was OSHA came in and did a wall-to-wall, and they didn't just come in with one inspector. As Jim mentioned, sometimes they might come in with additional help, especially if there's something that's out of their expertise that they might want to make sure they've got good data on. Again, because that makes a more sound citation that they can write, right? And I remember the owner of the building was like, it wasn't fair. He came in and he had some HVAC expert, they had an electrician guy. I'm like, what's not fair about that? They're bringing experts in to evaluate this situation here. And so I was there working for this employer. And when I went in to do my initial walkthrough, I was devastated. I could not imagine people making it through a day working in here. In fact, I've got asthma. It usually doesn't flare up, but I was in this place for an hour. It was 2.5 hours from my home, and I was violently coughing all the way home. In electroplating, you've got a lot of acids, very strong acids, and there's a lot of very strict requirements on making sure that those are controlled. And this place was not. I mean, it smelled like a pickle factory. It was egregious. Anyway, so I was here because there were a number of repeat, serious, and willful citations. And there was a pretty large dollar value. We'll get into that in a minute. But basically what happened was, I told this company owner, look, you've got to get this stuff cleaned up and controlled, or else you're looking at going out of business. Because the citation dollar value was pretty high. And I got the feeling from talking to the associate director that more of the book was going to be thrown at them. So what I did is I said, look, let's have this informal conference, which OSHA said you should have. So we did that, and I did it together, and I spoke for the employer. And we agreed to come up with a table of what we were going to do, not just to abate and fix the hazards that OSHA cited them for, but to do some proactive things. And this is where I'm going to throw the term Health and Safety Committee out there. This is another place where you can really get a good bang for your buck. If you develop, a joint labor management health and safety committee, you can really be proactive, and hopefully you're going to be able to reduce your incidence of accidents and harmful toxic exposures. So anyway, not to belabor this too much, but there were a number of citations that were there. So what I did is I made sure that I listed every single citation, and then how we were going to fix them. We had a target date. And then I had other things like establish and over here on the left side, establish a joint labor management safety committee comprised of at least one management representative, one worker safety lead, and 2 additional worker representatives. I basically told this employer, look, you better prove to OSHA that you really care about these workers, because when they came into your house, they found a complete mess. And it certainly does not look like you care for them. And I, as your consultant, I don't feel like you care for them. So let's try to do better. did a lot of proactive stuff. Next slide, Jim. Okay, so this was a transition. So the initial penalties was 325,000. This was not a very large square area footprint facility. After the initial consultation, he agreed if I came up with this and the employer signed off on it, that they would drop it down to 195,000. And then he said, look, I can't do any more, but our director can. So if you go through this, if you implement everything, we'll come and we'll look at this after. So next slide, Jim. This is the final one. These are just some other examples of things that we had up on here that I wanted to implement. Come to find out, I did this. The employer, the owners stopped communicating with OSHA. I stopped communicating with the employer because I didn't need to anymore. My job was done. Because this was work done through a colleague of mine, I was paid. My colleague was not paid. I got a call from the assistant director and said, hey, Bernie, have you ever heard from this place again? I said, no, I did not. And he said, okay. And I said, why? And I said, I'd like to know because I want you to know that I have not been connected with them because my name is very important. And sure enough, this employer decided to skirt their responsibility. And from my understanding, they're not in business anymore, at least under the name that I went in there. So this was a good example of what OSHA is willing to do if an employer will go and make things right. And it is easier to make things right if you put worker involvement right at the front of the line. That's why the first thing that I had on that table before, even before I got to the citations, addressing them like you see here, the willfuls and the repeats, I put in place, let's get workers here. Let's make a health and safety committee. Let's make sure we've got an advanced training program that's robust, et cetera, et cetera. And OSHA said, this is good. This could lead to something. But unfortunately, it never happened. So there's opportunities to do this, with your contractors. If we can participate like this, at the local level. And again, you'd imagine that, especially in the construction realm, you might have smaller, mid-sized, and then you've got your really large contractors. The really large ones, might have a health and safety professional that's on staff. They might have an understanding of how to do this. But the 12-person contractors, 15, 50 folks, they might not have the resources or the wherewithal or the understanding to do this stuff, to make sure that they've got a workplace free of recognized health and safety hazards. It's not an excuse because they have to by law, and morally it's the right thing to do. But nonetheless, I go back to that blue line that Jim talks about. They just might not understand what to do. Now, OSHA does have a consultation program, and that varies in quality from state to state. It's really not well funded. I had a mentor of mine, do some work in our New Hampshire one, but he did it more just to try to provide some public good service because it's not well funded. The problem though with using that is once that person comes in and does an assessment of your workplace, you're on the hook. There's a paper trail, whatever it is they find, you've got to make sure that you clean up. So there's that kind of thing. But aside from using the consultation program, if you get involved, with the employer right away, develop a health and safety committee, you can work towards addressing some of this stuff. And I've had a number of, I recognize a number of the names in the list. I've seen you folks before. We've had discussions. Some of you have been in my classes. Your health and safety is strong. You got strong kung fu. So, you'd really be an asset, to contractors if we could, crack into a health and safety type committee. And again, it's not the intent for us to do their job for them. That's not what I'm talking about. It's a collaborative process, right? The resources, the time, all that stuff, the responsibility has to be on the employer side. But we can participate. And by doing so, it will make a more health and safe work environment. That is all I've got. How are we on time?
We are good, Bernie. I just like to add a couple things because, it was definitely great content, great information. But I just want to talk a little bit about, what I did when I was in the field for 20 plus years running work. Because not only did I have to look out for the members as being a union member myself, but I also had to look out for the contractor's interest at the same time. So kind of like you had to wear two hats when you were running that work, and that's what you were in charge of. The first thing is documentation. You guys, when you were talking about all this content here, you talked about, you know, documentation and having training and all that. And the first thing that I learned is when the job first started, I would fill out, at that time we used folders. Now we're using a lot on the internet. So I would do it on the internet, but make folders for, you know, all my safety type paperwork. This is before I even started gathering the paperwork. So if somebody came in with a respirator fit test, I had an envelope that said a respirator fit test, and a piece of paper went right in there. So the filing system was already created. So when OSHA came in for inspections and they asked me for documentation, all I had to do is pull out that folder and say, here you go. I didn't have to search for it and look for it, which actually helped out. And a lot of that was to, you know, protect the company's interest, to prove and show the training. And then I had to look out for, you know, the members, or at that point in time, the workers that were working for me. And what I did to do that is that I gave the workers the opportunities to be safe. I gave them all the safety gear that they needed. And the way I did that was I walked the job site and really concentrated on things that could possibly happen. And if I felt that it could possibly happen, I had some type of safety gear on site to mitigate that risk. So I did not have to get into a situation and not have some type of safety gear on site that could help me mitigate that risk. So I look at it like this, especially as being a union, you know, we have to educate our members to be safe, but we also have to educate our employers how to keep our members safe at the same time, you know, meeting their production goals. And company doesn't want to hear, well, you know, we have to do this to keep them safe. We have to do this to keep them safe. No, show them why we need to do this to keep them safe, and that it's not going to hurt their bottom line by doing it this way if it's done ahead of time, if it's prepared ahead of time. So it's not just educating our members, it's educating our contractors at the same time. So when we have those opportunities to sit down with that contractor, and maybe there's a new job coming up, maybe they got a tank job that's coming, right? Why not sitting down with the contractor to say, what kind of training would you be looking at, you know, in the safety side of things when you're doing this job? And it might be a new type of system that they're using, but we wouldn't have been aware of that unless we asked the question. So a lot of times just sitting down with a contractor, finding out their process, the way they're going to do their job, and then maybe doing some additional training within the union hall can help prevent those injuries. And we would not even have an OSHA investigation in the long run. So I just wanted to add that, Bernie, before we went to questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I
Hey,
appreciate it.
Jim or Bernie, this is Dan Penske. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I think this is a great seminar and great information. As I'm looking through the panel here, we have a lot of young, brand new DOTs sitting on this panel, and we run training centers that are some of them have quite a bit of money within their funds. Mm-hmm. When they have a journeyman upgrade or when they have apprenticeship training at their facilities, what role are those JTCs playing? Are they playing the role of an employer if, you know, Johnny Q. Glazer's in that training center and cuts off a couple of digits on a chop saw, or there's no eye wash station, or, you know, they're not practicing what we should be practicing in our training centers? Safety glasses, somebody gets some metal in their eye from drilling. How do these, or what role do these training directors play? And this is for anybody really, because I really don't know the answer anymore to this question. But to protect our trust funds and to keep our training directors and instructors and coordinators, you know, within the guidelines. Can OSHA come in to our facilities and gig the training centers? Could an apprentice, you know, call up OSHA and say, hey, come on down here and take a look? Could this cause us a big deep pocket financial burden to our training centers if we're not practicing what we're preaching here.
Can I kind of answer a question of what we've done?
Yeah, sure.
So Dan, this is Alex. So we've partnered with our local OSHA partners, and we've invited them into our training centers. For one, so they can help us get it right wherever we're lacking. And as long as you partner with them and invite them in ahead of time, they'll work with you and they'll help give you the guidance. And you just want to keep inviting them during different times of year, like a meet and greet and whatnot. That's the best bet at a training center, is just to invite them in and say, hey, we want to partner and we want to make sure that we're completely in compliance with you. Can you help guide us? And they love to come in and have something to do.
Alex, did they tell you by any chance who would be liable if somebody got hurt? Say they come into your, invite them into your training center, and you know, you build this relationship up, and you know, say somebody did get hurt seriously in that training center. Is it, and I heard this years ago, and I don't know how true this is, and this is where I'm wondering with a lot of these young training directors and coordinators. I was told back in the day when me and Ulysses Grant were apprentices together, that if the contractor, if an apprentice was working for the contractor and he came to work at the training, or he came to the training center to do his classroom related, and he got hurt, he was going to go on the compensation, and everything was going on the employer. If he was unemployed and he was coming into school, everything was going on to the JTC. So with that, I was told at the time that the violations, any violations, could be that of that training center. But I really don't know the answer. And I think, you know, to protect ourselves as we're growing and we're looking at some of the finances that some of these training centers are really carrying in their purses, there's some big money there. And there could be, you know, either a big citation, there could be a big comp case, there could be multiple bigs to what's going on. And I'm sure it's not just us here in the US. I'm sure it's our Canadian brothers and sisters in Canada also. You know, one major injury could cripple us. So those are just a couple of things that I wanted to throw out there. And I don't know the answer. I wish I had the answers to some of this. And but I like your idea, Alex, you know, to partner up with OSHA, bring them in. We could probably blend that in with, you know, our OSHA training, you know, for our apprentices as they're there to ask questions and so on. So I appreciate the opportunity to throw those couple of questions out there. And again, I apologize. I don't know the answer. I think as we're moving forward, we have to look at some of our facilities and say, how do we mitigate any issues that could happen there? Thank you.
Yeah, and that's particularly important because of some of the nuances from one state to the next, because some of what you're talking about here are state, you know, like this, the worker comp implications of this are state laws, and also, you know, some of the definition of what an apprentice is different from one state to the next, and so there's also often a delineation if it's an apprentice versus a journey person training too. So yeah, I'd highly want to, I'd very much want to talk to an attorney familiar with all those employment law stuff for my state to understand it. But Bernie, I think you hit the key point is even if it is a student and not an employee, you are an employer as well as just an education facility, because at least you on the phone are on the payroll, if not others.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's, you know, hazards are almost equal opportunity. The student can go and get clipped by it, but so too couldn't one of the, you know, the members that is working for that fund in the building. So
I would check your local labor law codes too, because in California, in the labor code, it states that the employer is responsible for all apprenticeship training.
Excellent. Any other questions for Jim? Well, we have him on the phone here, or Bernie?
Sorry, I don't know that one.
it's Alexa.
Yeah, it was mine. My Alexa started talking after.
They spy on us.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, if there, if while you're thinking of any questions, one thing I should have also mentioned back earlier on around the example from Las Vegas was that being a state OSHA program. This is really into the weeds and would take some other conversation. But there is a process within the OSHA Act that if we have an issue or concern with the way a state OSHA is doing their job, it's called a complaint against the state program, or CASPA. And, you know, that is something, like everything else at OSHA, it kind of has mixed results. You're not going to get exactly what you want out of that process, but it is something that would raise the level of awareness if that's something that the union were interested in. You know, talk to Bernie. Bernie, you know, I can point you to a number of people that have a lot of experience with those in other unions. So.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm a little, you know, Vegas is a little new to me, so you know, I'm sure there's some underseen issues in Las Vegas on who made what call during that transition. Kind of a little scary, you know. The ex-mayor was the bookkeeper for the mafia. Now his wife's the mayor. So who knows how that went down? Some questions are, you know, we'll see how far we take this.
2020. Do you know, and maybe, you know, maybe Ken, you can answer this, but, you know, a lot of us are familiar with what happened in City Center in Vegas. I mean, you know, what was it, 11, 12 fatalities just in one building?
It depends on if you count it as an on-site death or
Okay.
off-site death. If you're on an ambulance off the site, then they don't consider it as a person dying on site.
Did they ever eliminate the root causes of how that was allowed to happen? Is that still around, that I don't know what you would call it, the culture that allowed that to happen?
OSHA violations after all those deaths, not a single violation. Yeah, it's still around. Things seem to disappear over there. Still learning that.
Yeah, and Bernie, I think that just goes, you know, back to that educational process. You know, educated our members of what to do and what to look out for. Because I mean, there's always a risk, and some job sites are greater than others. It's just really, you know, getting out there and actually doing that walk yourself instead of just hearing it from the members. Walk the job site yourself and maybe adjust your training in a way that, you know, could help protect those workers that are working in an environment like that. Because, you know, City Center was just a bad environment. I don't think there was that one time you could walk on that site without something hanging over your head. You know, so the site in itself was just a great hazard. Well, if there's no comments, again, I want to tell everybody that I personally appreciate, you know, everybody getting on the call and taking their time to listen to Jim. Jim, I appreciate you taking your time getting on this call. I know that your time has been busy lately too. Bernie, I appreciate your comments and feedback. It's always good to learn from you. But most importantly, you know, it's us as trainers, and our responsibilities is to making sure that our instructors are educating our members well enough that they are aware enough of how to protect themselves on a job site. But I also believe it's our responsibility to educate our contractors on how they can also protect our members and at the same time meeting their bottom line. So I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. See ya.
Thank you. And thank you, Jim. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Bernard.
Much appreciated.
You guys spending the time with us.
Thanks, everybody.
Stay safe.